Arthur never imagined that a simple hire would change his life forever. The young man named Paul, who came to take care of his garden, brought more than just tools with him. He carried a past wrapped in mystery and pain. Arthur, a 60-year-old man, lived in a large mansion surrounded by memories. Ever since he had lost his wife, the garden she loved so much had become a sort of refuge, but also a constant reminder of what he had lost. The orchids, her favorite flowers, now grew without the same care and affection they had before. So, following a neighbor's recommendation, Arthur hired Paul, a young gardener, to breathe new life into the garden. Paul had the youth, strength, and enthusiasm that Arthur no longer possessed. At their first meeting, Paul arrived with a genuine smile and was ready to start the job. Arthur watched from afar as the young man started working with the plants, trying to decide if he could trust Paul with the orchids, a sentimental treasure that he hardly allowed anyone to touch. As minutes passed, he approached, ready to give specific instructions on how to care for this garden so full of memories. But as he got closer, something caught his eye and made him stop suddenly. A simple fabric bracelet on Paul's wrist. Arthur immediately felt a wave of emotion wash over him. That bracelet was not just any ordinary piece. It had immense sentimental value because he and his wife had made it together with fabric brought from Egypt during their honeymoon many years ago. The bracelet was a gift she had made for their son, who mysteriously disappeared as a child. What was Paul doing with a bracelet exactly like that? Arthur's mind started spinning, and he had to force himself to stay calm, not letting the storm of emotions brewing inside him show. Arthur spent the following days haunted by the bracelet on Paul's wrist. He tried to act normally, but the thought of that piece followed him at every moment. The bracelet was something so personal, made with so much care and love, that he couldn't accept the coincidence of seeing it on the arm of a young stranger. Arthur could hardly sleep, his nights now filled with painful memories and questions he couldn't answer. Was it just a cruel coincidence, or was something deeper at play? While Paul continued working in the garden, Arthur began watching him more closely, paying attention to the details. He noticed that Paul seemed unaware of the sentimental value of the bracelet, acting naturally while tending to the plants. However, Arthur found himself more and more distracted, searching for clues in the conversations he had with the young man. He needed to know more about Paul's background, but didn't know where to start, fearing he might come off as intrusive or, worse, raise unnecessary suspicions. The doubt ate away at Arthur. He wanted to ask directly about the bracelet, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Fear that the answers would bring out a truth he wasn't ready to face. Paul, on the other hand, continued with his work, unaware of the emotional battle going on around him. Arthur knew he would need to find a way to get more information, but the right moment still seemed far off, leaving him torn between curiosity and fear of what he might discover. When Paul finished the work in the garden, Arthur realized he couldn't just let him go. The doubt about the bracelet still lingered in his mind, and the thought of not seeing the young man again, without having the chance to investigate further, was something he couldn't bear. He watched as Paul packed up his tools, ready to leave, and quickly came up with an excuse to keep him around. The orchids were already perfect, but there were other parts of the garden that might need attention. "Paul, I've been thinking about making some changes to the front garden. Maybe you could help me with that," Arthur said, trying to sound casual. The young man, always eager and polite, smiled and accepted the new task. Arthur knew that, for now, this would give him the opportunity to investigate more about Paul's past. But he would have to be careful. What was at stake was more than just curiosity. It was an emotional matter that was slowly consuming him. Each visit from Paul might bring answers, or maybe more questions, but Arthur was determined to find out. With Paul working more days in the garden, Arthur began planning subtle ways to talk to him about his childhood and background without raising suspicions. He knew that any misstep could drive the young man away or end his chances of discovering the truth. It was a delicate game Arthur was playing, but the weight of uncertainty pushed him forward. He needed to know if Paul was just another young gardener or possibly the son he had lost so many years ago. As the urgency grew, Arthur realized that just watching Paul in the garden wouldn't be enough. He needed a more personal connection with Paul, something that would allow him to know more about the young man beyond his polite and distant answers. That's when, on an ordinary workday, Arthur invited him to lunch inside the house, something he had never done with any employee before. Paul, surprised by the invitation, accepted with a shy smile, but inside, he found the situation strange. No employer had ever been so intimate with him. He was used to being treated as just a gardener, and the idea of sitting at the dinner table with Arthur made him uncomfortable. During lunch, Arthur tried to be as friendly as possible, asking trivial questions about Paul's life, always looking for an opening to learn more about his past. The conversation flowed slowly, with Paul responding politely, but keeping a certain distance. At the same time, Arthur noticed how the young man seemed unused to this kind of treatment, which only increased his curiosity about what was really behind his story. Paul ate with manners, but his underlying distrust was always there. He couldn't understand why Arthur was treating him so differently from his other employers. When lunch was about to end, Paul mentioned something that made Arthur's heart race. He explained that the next day he would finish all the work in the garden and that he planned to leave the city soon. Life in big cities was getting harder, with high living costs and few steady jobs. Paul was thinking about moving to a small town, where he believed he'd have a better chance of finding stability. Arthur felt a tightening in his chest, the idea of losing contact with the young man, and with that, the chance to unravel the mystery of the bracelet, worried him deeply. He knew he had to act fast or risk losing the opportunity to discover the truth forever. Arthur went to bed that night with his mind in turmoil. On one hand, he tried to convince himself that it was all just a coincidence, that Paul couldn't be more than a young man who, by chance, wore a bracelet similar to his missing son's. But deep down, something inside him screamed that there was more to the situation. He felt in his heart that he couldn't simply ignore the signs. Even so, doubt mixed with anxiety, and Arthur spent hours lying there, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. When he could no longer bear the flood of thoughts, he got out of bed and went to the living room, where an old framed photo of his late wife stood. Looking at the picture, the longing hit him hard. That woman he had loved so much, who had left a huge void in his life, felt almost physically present in that moment. He became deeply emotional, and the tears, which Arthur rarely allowed himself, began streaming down his face. He felt more vulnerable than ever, lost between the pain of the past and the mystery of the present. Between sobs, he eventually fell asleep on the couch. The next morning, Arthur woke up startled, still wrapped in the emotions of the night before. Then, he remembered the dream he had. He saw his wife beside him and their small child, tying the bracelet around the boy's wrist, a gesture full of love and symbolism. In the dream, his wife didn't say anything, just smiled with a serenity that deeply moved him, and shortly after, she disappeared. The dream left him thoughtful and restless. Maybe it was a sign, a message that he shouldn't ignore what he was feeling. That's when an idea occurred to him. Instead of letting Paul leave, he could offer him a permanent job as the gardener and caretaker of the mansion's grounds. That way, the young man would stay nearby, and Arthur would have more time to discreetly investigate his true origins. When Paul arrived the next day, Arthur was more determined than ever. He called the young man inside the mansion and, with a more serious yet hopeful tone, offered him the permanent job of taking care of the garden and the estate's outdoor areas. Paul, surprised, stayed silent for a moment, absorbing what he had just heard. When he finally responded, relief and gratitude were evident in his voice. "I don't even know how to thank you, sir. I promise I'll take care of everything with as much care as if it were my own." Arthur smiled, relieved by the acceptance. He knew that this decision would not only keep Paul close, but also give him more opportunities to learn about the young man's life. Paul's work soon began to show results. The orchids, which had been almost forgotten, started blooming again with a beauty that Arthur hadn't seen since the time his wife was alive. It was as if the garden itself was coming back to life, reflecting the care and dedication Paul put into every detail. One sunny afternoon, while Paul was watering the plants, Arthur took the opportunity to approach and start a more personal conversation. He asked about Paul's life, his experiences, always trying to stay subtle, but seeking answers that could explain the mystery of the bracelet. Paul, perhaps sensing Arthur's trust, began to open up. He told Arthur that he had been abandoned as a child and was raised in an orphanage. "I was 7 years old when they took me there," he said, with a hint of sadness in his eyes. "People always wanted to adopt babies, you know? No one cared about older kids. So, I ended up growing up in the orphanage, watching the other kids leave, while I stayed behind." Arthur felt a pang of pain in his heart upon hearing this. Paul's story seemed more and more connected to the loss of his son, and he realized that fate might be revealing something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Arthur could no longer hide the unease he felt after hearing Paul's story. The young man's words left him shaken, and he knew he couldn't ignore the signs anymore. As soon as he had the chance, he quickly left the garden, his heart racing and his mind swirling. Paul's story, the abandonment, the childhood in an orphanage, it all seemed to connect with the painful memories of his missing son. Arthur picked up the phone and called his lawyer, explaining the situation in detail. He needed immediate help. He asked the lawyer to hire a private detective to discreetly investigate Paul's past without the young man suspecting anything. As the lawyer sped up the process, Arthur tried to act normally around Paul, but his nervousness was noticeable. He found himself watching the young man more intensely than before, searching for any clue, any detail that might confirm his suspicions. In every conversation they had, Arthur tried to extract more information, but without raising suspicions. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. Paul, on the other hand, began to find Arthur's behavior a bit strange. He already saw him as a very friendly man, perhaps even more so than any other employer he had had. But something didn't add up. The long conversations, the unusual interest in his personal life. Paul concluded that Arthur was just a lonely man in need of companionship and attention. Although he found the situation odd at times, Paul didn't feel uncomfortable, just surprised by Arthur's kindness. He continued working in the garden with dedication, unaware that his employer was investigating every aspect of his past. Arthur, however, grew more and more convinced that Paul could be his son. The detective was about to start his search, and Arthur knew the truth, whatever it was very close to being revealed. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Arthur and Paul began to naturally deepen. Although Arthur was worried about what the detective might discover, he couldn't ignore the bond that was starting to form between him and the young gardener. Paul, who had always been reserved, began opening up more during their long conversations in the garden. He shared stories of his childhood, the hardships he faced growing up in an orphanage, and the constant feeling of not belonging anywhere. Arthur listened closely, always comparing Paul's accounts with what he knew about his missing son. Paul spoke with a certain sadness, but also with a mature acceptance. "Life was hard, but I think it made me stronger," he said with a shy smile. He mentioned how he had always tried to find his way in the world, working different jobs, never truly feeling at home. Arthur, on the other hand, felt a mix of empathy and anguish. With every detail Paul revealed, Arthur found himself more and more drawn into the young man's story. There was an emotional connection forming between them, something that went beyond mere curiosity or suspicion. It was as if, unconsciously, Arthur already saw him as part of his family. With time, Paul began to trust Arthur more, appreciating the company and support he offered. Deep down, Paul saw Arthur as a lonely man, but also as someone who genuinely cared. This unexpected closeness made Arthur even more certain that he needed to discover the truth. There was something very special about their relationship, and he couldn't just ignore what he was feeling. While the detective continued the investigation, Arthur became more and more attached to Paul, imagining what it would be like if his suspicions were correct. On a day that seemed like any other, Arthur could no longer hold back his curiosity. He finally asked Paul about the bracelet, his heart racing and a sense of urgency he could barely conceal. "Where did you get that bracelet?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Paul looked at his wrist, seemingly surprised by the unusual interest. "I got it from a woman. I don't even know her name. She took care of me for a while, right before I was sent to the orphanage." That response hit Arthur like a shock, and he felt his chest tighten even more. The coincidence was too big to ignore. Arthur's mind traveled back in time, He remembered the day his wife had made the bracelet for their son, a symbol of eternal love that he had worn on his wrist like a talisman. Now, years later, it was there on Paul's wrist. Arthur tried to remain calm, but he couldn't avoid the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. This woman, do you remember anything else about her? Paul paused, trying to search his memory. She was kind to me, but soon after, she disappeared, and I ended up in the orphanage. Paul's words echoed in Arthur's mind, further confirming his suspicions. With his heart aching and increasingly convinced that Paul was his son, Arthur wasted no time. He asked the detective to investigate this mysterious woman. Who was she? And how had she become involved in Paul's life? The investigation was swift and thorough. The detective discovered that the woman had been a key witness in the abandonment of a child in a park many years ago. She wasn't Paul's mother, but she had cared for him briefly, acting as a temporary guardian before he was sent to the orphanage. This detail alone was devastating for Arthur, reinforcing his belief that Paul really could be his lost son. When the detective brought back the information, Arthur felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. Everything seemed to point to what he had most feared and, at the same time, most wanted. Paul was his son. The bracelet, the orphanage story, the unknown woman, each piece of the puzzle fit together with painful precision. He was one step away from the truth. But was he ready to face it? With each passing minute, the tension grew, and Arthur knew he couldn't escape the inevitable. He needed definitive confirmation, something that would erase any remaining doubt. Determined to end the uncertainty once and for all, Arthur made a decision. He suggested to Paul that he take a DNA test, trying to sound casual, though the anxiety gnawed at him from within. You know, it might be interesting to find out more about your origins, don't you think? Arthur commented, hiding the true reason behind the request. Paul, not fully understanding the real motive, agreed to the suggestion with mild discomfort, unaware of the weight it carried. The young man had never been particularly interested in his past, but if Arthur, whom he was beginning to see as a friend, thought it was important, he would go along with it. The days that followed were a real test of patience for Arthur. Every second seemed to drag on as he waited for the results. He could hardly sleep, tormented by thoughts of what would happen if his suspicions were confirmed. What if Paul didn't accept the truth? What if, after all these years, the young man didn't want to have any relationship with him? The doubts haunted him, and time seemed to move in slow motion. Paul, on the other hand, showed little concern. For him, it was just another test, a curiosity to satisfy Arthur. When the envelope with the results finally arrived, Arthur almost couldn't bring himself to open it. His hands trembled as he tore through the paper, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He read the results in silence, and what he saw left him completely speechless. Paul was indeed his long-lost son. The confirmation he had both dreaded and longed for had arrived. The emotion hit Arthur in a way he couldn't control. Silent tears ran down his face as the reality hit him with full force. All those years of pain and uncertainty finally made sense, but now he faced the dilemma of how to tell Paul the truth. The weight of the revelation was overwhelming. Arthur knew that this truth would change both of their lives forever, but the question that tormented him was, how would Paul react? The young man, who had spent his life without knowing his true origins, would now have to deal with a revelation that could turn his world upside down. Arthur, as happy as he was to have found his son, feared Paul's reaction. Determined not to prolong the suspense any longer, Arthur knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The truth, however painful, had to be told. Arthur knew this was a decisive moment. He couldn't delay what seemed inevitable any longer. One day, while Paul was tending the garden, Arthur called him over for a more private conversation. They sat on the porch, and Arthur, with a trembling voice and a racing heart, began to tell his story. He talked about the bracelet, about the son who had disappeared many years ago, and about how devastating that loss had been for him and his wife. Paul listened carefully, feeling a weight growing in his chest, but still not fully understanding the reason for the conversation. When Arthur finally said the words that would change everything, silence fell. "Paul, I did a DNA test. You are my son." Paul froze completely. It was as if the world had stopped in that moment. He blinked a few times, trying to process what he had just heard. At first, he didn't believe it. How could this be true? His whole life had been a struggle to understand who he was, to find some meaning in his past. Now, this revelation had come so abruptly that he barely knew what to feel. Confusion, disbelief, and a whirlwind of emotions overwhelmed him. Arthur, in turn, remained silent, waiting for Paul's reaction. He knew it wouldn't be easy for the young man to accept everything right away. "I understand this is a lot for you to process, Paul," Arthur said, his voice choked with emotion. "I just want you to know that, even after all these years, I never stopped looking for you. I know that might not mean much now, but you've always been a part of me." Paul remained in shock, unsure how to respond. The idea of having found the father he never knew was overwhelming, and he would need time to come to terms with it. The days following the revelation were tense. Paul avoided spending too much time around Arthur, needing space to think. He spent several sleepless nights trying to sort through the thoughts and emotions that had suddenly surfaced. As much as the truth had been revealed, the scars of a lifetime without answers wouldn't disappear so quickly. Paul felt torn between curiosity and fear of getting closer to Arthur, of truly accepting that this man was his biological father. How was he supposed to deal with this new reality? Could he rebuild a relationship that had never existed? Arthur, on the other hand, tried to be patient, though the anxiety was eating him up inside. He understood that he couldn't force anything, that Paul needed time to process the information. However, the distance between them bothered him deeply. He knew he would need more than words to build a bridge between them. Reflecting on how he could touch Paul's heart, Arthur decided to send something that would tell the story of the unwavering love he and his wife had always had for their lost son. Arthur gathered a photo album filled with happy family moments, images that captured the days full of joy and hope before the tragedy. Along with the album, he included newspaper clippings that showed their relentless search for news about their missing son, and finally, the diary that his wife had kept over the years. She had written in it every day, recording her love and belief that one day their son would return. When Paul received the package and began flipping through the album and reading the words written by a mother who had never given up on him, something broke inside of him. Every page he turned brought up a wave of emotions he wasn't prepared to face. He saw the pain etched in the old photos, realized the depth of the love the couple had for him, and understood, for the first time, that his absence had left a deep void not only in Arthur's life but also in his mother's. The diary in particular moved him the most. In it, his mother wrote letters to him, telling him about her daily life, her prayers, and her certainty that he would come back one day. Her words, filled with longing and hope, touched Paul deeply, making him realize that he was, indeed, part of that family. Deeply moved and unable to ignore what he had read, Paul made a decision. He could no longer run from the truth or the emotions that gesture had stirred in him. With a heavy but determined heart, he went to see Arthur. When he arrived at the house, Paul saw Arthur sitting on the porch as always, but this time something had changed. Paul no longer felt like a stranger. He walked up to Arthur, and the two sat in silence for a few seconds, just looking at each other, unsure of how to start speaking. Arthur felt a mix of relief and nervousness, but what prevailed was the love that had never disappeared. Time seemed to stop, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the connection that was slowly being rebuilt. Paul took a deep breath, holding his mother's diary in his hands. He handed it to Arthur, who held the book delicately, as if receiving a piece of his late wife's soul. "I read every word," Paul began, his voice trembling. "I felt like I could hear her. She never gave up on me." Arthur, with tears in his eyes, simply nodded. He knew he didn't need to say much. What had been written in that diary was more powerful than any explanation he could offer. Arthur finally broke the silence, whispering, "She believed you would come back." All these years, she held on to that hope. The tears running down Paul's face showed just how deeply those words touched him. It was as if his mother's spirit was there between them, uniting them in an invisible embrace. Still, the road to reconciliation wouldn't be easy. The emotional scars of years of separation were present in every word, in every hesitant gesture. Paul struggled to accept his new role as a son, and Arthur desperately tried to make up for the lost years. The pain of absence still weighed on them, but the desire to heal those wounds was stronger. Little by little, their daily interactions began to restore what had been broken. The conversations grew longer, and Paul finally felt like he could trust. They were building something new with the promise that, this time, there would be no more separations. Arthur, who had once lived consumed by longing and regret, found a purpose in strengthening his bond with Paul. For Paul, on the other hand, the feeling of belonging to something bigger, a family that had never given up on him, filled a void he didn't even know he had. In the garden, the orchids, which Arthur had always tended to so lovingly, seemed to respond to the reunion of father and son. The flowers, once cherished by Arthur's late wife, were more vibrant than ever. The orchids weren't just blooming. They were multiplying almost magically, as if the mother's love, who had always believed in her son's return, was present, blessing the reconciliation. To Arthur, it was as if his late wife was rejoicing in the reunion, expressing her joy through the stunning beauty of the flowers. Together, Arthur and Paul began sharing moments that went far beyond the garden. Arthur often told stories about his childhood and the happy days he spent with his wife, while Paul opened his heart about the challenges of growing up without a family. Each conversation, each gesture of affection, felt like another step toward rebuilding a love that should never have been interrupted. The mansion, which had once felt empty, full of painful memories, now flourished like the garden, full of life, hope, and the promise of a new beginning. So, did you like that story? Leave your comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, and if you want more gripping stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next videos, which are full of twists, triumphs, and life lessons that will touch your heart. Now, why not click on the recommended video on the screen? I guarantee it will move you even more. See you in the next video.